Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, welcome. My name's John Ferguson. I am from the Economist Group, Economist Impact, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a moment. But I just want to say thank you for coming. I'd like to also thank the WTO for having us. They have kept the best for last. So really wonderful to see you all. And for those joining us online, we have a fascinating discussion. I'm going to share a little agenda with you in a moment, but this is a really critical topic for us at Economist Impact, and I'll tell you more about it at the moment. But we have a great panel with four fantastic people sitting next to me to talk about this really, really important topic of illicit trade. The actual theme of the next hour and 15 minutes is digitalisation and illicit trade, how technology helps and hinders illegal markets. But before I jump into the agenda, just on myself and Economist Impact, I lead a research team that looks at new globalization, everything to do with trade, supply chains, and therefore illicit trade sits right in the middle of that. But many of you will not know Economist Impact. We were only born a few years ago. We are part of the Economist Group, of course. You've all got the actual newspaper in front of you, and those online, you can jump online. But Economist Impact is, you can think of us as the think tank within the Economist Group. So we do research with the support of sponsors and in this case, Philip Morris International on illicit trade, which we've been doing for a long time now. And then we use our media channels to take that research out to the world. So that's Economist Impact. We're relatively new. You may not have heard of us, but that's who we are and who I am. So now you know who I am and who we are. The agenda for today, before you get to your rum session, and I've heard a lot about this rum session, so this is going to be great before you get to the rum. I want to introduce our research program. And again, we've been looking at illicit trade for a long time, but I want to introduce our research program. I then want to give you some initial results of that program, start to talk about some digitalisation trends, and that will set the scene for our great panel discussion. And if I manage my time correctly, which I will, we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So let's jump in. At Economist Impact, with the support of PMI, we've been looking at and building the Illicit Trade Environment Index. Now, we've had a couple of iterations of this, and we're in the middle now of doing it again. At the Economist Group and at Economist Impact, we love indices. We build indices for everything. And here is about illicit trade. So what we do when we build an index, we have pillars. We collect data, we bring those pillars together, those indicators together. And for illicit trade, the Illicit Trade Environment Index, we've got these four pillars that we think really capture the universe of trying to guard against illicit trade. So you've got governance and cooperation. So we look for indicators and data on things like international commitments, cooperation, and compliance. The second pillar there is surveillance and enforcement. So our research teams are gathering data around law enforcement, monitoring and reporting, for example. The third pillar there, customs and border management, a big part of trying to guard against illicit trade, of course, and think about digitalisation and automation processes and systems in that pillar. And finally, there's a pillar around economic management and the regulatory environment. And you can think about taxation sits in that bucket. Now, on the right there, at the moment, this initial sort of regional-based index, we have 25 countries, and that's some of the initial results I'll share with you in a couple of minutes. But we're also expanding this to be a global index. So by the end of this year, if I can keep to task, we'll have 87 countries in this index. Now, to tell you again, if you may not know too much about Economist Impact, this is how we do our research. This is a very standard approach, and we've taken that approach with the Illicit Trade Environment Index. We often begin with a literature review. Now, we've been doing this for years, but we do take on board, maybe what the WTO says, many other institutions, and bring all that literature together. The bottom bullet point, we do a lot of data collection, so both primary and secondary data collection. So we use secondary sources, but we also do a lot of scoring ourselves. So some of those indicators that I spoke about a couple of minutes ago, if we can't find a credible secondary source, we will score it ourselves, and we take a robust approach to trying to score those hard to score indicators. But the middle point there is about conducting or convening an international panel of experts, which we did for this program, and we do for a lot of our programs. And on the right-hand side, with all my creativity of creating bubbles, we've just got some highlights of what some of the panel experts have spoken about, and I'm sure some of these points will come up here today. At the top there, someone was really emphasising the importance of public-private cooperation. The top right there, whistleblower protections are critical. And that big one in the middle, the person was making the point about how do we incorporate collaboration mechanisms between industry and customs. So that were just some highlights of the expert panel, but that just gives you a bit of a flavour of how we do our research at Economist Impact. So some initial results, and it's a work in progress, but what are our initial results? Well, I guess the main takeaway is these countries I think we've got in the index right now, which are highlighted there, there's a lot of room for improvement. No country is fully prepared to prevent these illicit trade threats. So out of the 25 countries we've got at the moment in the index, more than a third of them have these limited measures in place to effectively manage these threats. Out of the 25 countries, places like Hong Kong, Indonesia, and Malaysia fall within the second top bracket, scoring-wise, but we don't currently have a country in the top bracket. Now, that might change when we expand it globally, but at the moment, there's no country in our top bracket, which suggests a lot of upside, a lot of room for improvement. Algeria, Libya, Iraq falling a bit behind in the next category down. But overall, this is the point of the research and the point of today's panel. We think there's a lot to discuss and a lot to work on because there seems to be a lot of improvement that we can find in trying to fight illicit trade. So to help set up the panel, I just want to share some digitalisation trends or themes that are coming out of our research to this point. And these are the challenges before I look at some opportunities. So at the moment, the countries we're looking at, 100% of these countries do not have e-verification when it comes to counterfeit goods sold online. And I do want to ask our panel of experts up here about e-verification over the next hour or so. 73% of countries, meanwhile, have limited or no provisions to combat illicit trade in the online environment. So where are these provisions? What does a good regulation system look like is another question for today. And finally, down the bottom there, only 38% are without any national agency monitoring illicit trade online. So again, some room for improvements. But as I was trying to allude to earlier, that this is probably also where the opportunities lie. Digitalisation, we're all using it. We're using it right now, and thanks to those joining us online. There are some amazing technologies around. So how can we use these to help fight against and curb illicit trade? Customs modernisation. How do we use these technologies to really get more effective at the customs process? There's going to need to be some harmonisation and standardisation, but there's a real upside there. Data sharing and interoperability, which comes up in every panel and every expert panel we convene. But what's holding that back? How do we do that better? And can digitalisation help us do that? Track and trace. I have some private sector colleagues who are using track and trace to fight this, but how is that working with the public sector? How can we get better sort of collaboration maybe with the public sector on track and trace technologies to make sure things don't fall off the radar, so to speak? And finally, e-commerce and cybersecurity. How do we get better at that? Because there are some real upsides on e-commerce and regulation if we can get that right. But I guess the big takeaway before we jump into the panel is we think it needs a holistic approach. We're going to talk about solutions here. You'll notice when I start running the panel, we'll start more on the problem side of things. How does digitalisation actually help illicit trade? And then we'll go into the solutions. But when we get to the solutions, you'll see there's no one solution. This is going to be a systemic or holistic approach that's needed to fight illicit trade. Now, I think that's enough of me talking. Let me now introduce our fantastic panel. That's a photoshopped image of me, so let's move past that. But I'd really like to give a warm welcome, first of all, up the end to Mark Williams, who is the Program Manager, Organised Crime and Policing Team at RUSI. Next, a very warm welcome to Helena Yanchenko, Secretary at the National Investment Council of Ukraine. Next, a really nice and pleasant welcome, David. We see you a lot. David Luna, the Executive Director at the International Coalition Against Illicit Economies. And next to me, very, very happy to have Anna Caroline Muller here, Legal Affairs Officer, Government, Procurement and Competition Division here at the WTO. So Anna, David, Helena, Mark, really, really, really glad to have you here. Now, before we jump into sort of the challenges and the solutions, digitalisation, illicit trade, can we just start, maybe David, with you? I some of us might think about joining here in the room or joining us online. We might think about e-commerce as a place where illicit trade happens. And we do want to talk about that. But David, there's more. There's more to digitalization of illicit trade.
Yeah, that's right. First of all, let me thank the Economist Impact, the WTO, for hosting this important panel and dialogue. I do recall finally being here 10 years ago at the same public forum, where back then I was a diplomat trying to strengthen international cooperation across sectors. So, John, when you talk about public-private partnerships, I think it's critical to engage not only the private sector, but when we look at whole of society, to engage NGOs, academia, and many others, because it's that collective action that I think is very important. But specifically on your question, certainly when we talk about digitalization, I think it's important to look at it from a prism, not only of e-commerce, but really even more broadly, looking at digital commerce, because it's not only e-commerce. With technologies today, with social media, the social networking apps, when you look at the encryption technologies as well, every technology, every processes, every forms of doing better trade, clean trade, better commerce, better financial transactions is being exploited by criminals today. Criminals, fraudsters, scammers, and many others who are expanding the global illegal economy, which today, according to the IMF and many other international organizations, constitutes between $3 to $5 trillion a year. That is very significant, and I'll come back to that. But to start again the discussion, I think it has to be looked at it from the digital world universe, because every element within that universe is being exploited by bad actors.
Right. Thanks so much. And can I come to you? Did we miss anything? What else would you add before we get to the problems and solutions around digitalization, illicit trade? Any bits we're missing? Clearly e-commerce, but what else are we missing?
Well, yeah, so there's, I don't know, let me introduce the WTO, IMF, OECD, and UNCTAD handbook on measuring digital trade. And if you look at the concepts there, I think it helps shed light on what digital trade actually is. And it defines digital trade as digitally ordered or digitally delivered goods and services. And if you look at that, you have the e-commerce angle, which is kind of addressing how we order goods, right? And then you also have the whole realm of digital, like non-material goods that we're looking at now, the digitally delivered goods and the overlap between the two, of course. So I think in the conversation about illicit trade, we need to keep those concepts in mind, because the solutions are very different depending on whether you have a digitally ordered good that still goes through a normal customs process, or you have something that's entirely in the digital world and remains there. I'm from the intellectual property division here at the WTO, and we look more and more at IP as something that can be traded in itself, right? Because we're moving away from the physical goods and moving more and more into digitally delivered products. And there we also have, of course, issues with illicit trade, but the responses, and there I'm foreshadowing a little bit our conversation in half an hour, have to, of course, be much more focused on the digital solutions, even more than for the physical goods, because you don't have that layer of a customs processing.
And thank yous. Yeah, exactly. I know it's hard when someone like me asks you questions and we want to get the solutions. We do want to get the solutions. But Helena, and then I'll ask Mark as well. But Helena, when you think about digitalization, illicit trade, before we get to problems and solutions, what do you see? What are the sort of main ways that you think about this intersection of digitalization and illicit trade?
Hello, everyone. My name is Halina Yanchenko. I'm member of Parliament of Ukraine. I have some prejudice here, positive prejudice toward digitalization because of my background. My first university degree was social science, and given my my experience with data collection, data processing, I was one of the authors of digitalization actually reform in Ukraine 5 years ago when President Zelensky was running during the election. I suggested him to actually take the digitalization and put the whole country in digitalization. We were very inspired by Estonian experience. One of their presidents once won election with one slogan: "Your computer will never ask you for a bribe." And that was a good example to follow. Since that, over the past 5 years, we have created a state mobile application called DIA, and now people can interact with the state through this mobile application. So all documents is there, and when, for example, you should address state official, you can use your mobile application without any plastic or any like books or stuff with your IDs. Secondly, we put a lot of services there, services that can be provided by state toward their actually for citizens and also businesses. So I believe that while our world is moving very close into digitalization, everything, globalization as well, it is it's just objective that everything will go online, and it's only a matter what does the state do about that. Do we also go online to be more efficient, or do we try to say no online and actually forbid everything? I am a fan of the first approach. I sometimes I even call myself a preacher of digitalization, and I will tell you why. Because when we are talking about these online services and general digitalization of state governance, there are at least 3 big advantages and a bonus. The first advantage is no physical contact means no corruption risk. And we are talking about, like, when we're talking about various corruption risks, we also talk about the risks for businesses, for example. Yeah, the risks, for example, at customs or tax inspections or other kind of controlling or law enforcement bodies. The second advantage, it facilitates transparency. So basically, when one law enforcement body or person can actually check the results of another law enforcement person or body through using database, which is collected by actually providing a big number of services online, because you actually collect huge databases, yeah, of the results of the state. Third bonus, third advantage, it makes the work of law enforcement more efficient. Because once again, when you provide your services online and you keep record, you receive the huge database, and then you can use this so-called bell curve, and you don't need to go through 100 cases or 100 bodies or 100 companies. You just should take a look at the margins, something that is exceptional. And the big bonus, the fourth one, is that digitalization and digital interaction between the citizens and companies with state make the life of citizens, companies, and state officials much easier. So I'm a big fan of digitalization and using digital and online tools by the state, by law enforcement. And it's only a matter of how we can actually use that to tackle corruption risks and as well as illicit trade. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elena. Mark, can I bring you in now? Again, before you get to solutions, I know you look more at the sort of policing, law enforcement aspect, but just again, to help everyone in the room and online understand, because they may not spend a lot of time thinking about illicit trade, and that's part of why we do this work, is to get more people to think about it. But what do you see about how these criminal gangs are using these amazing tools, these digitalization, how are they using them to conduct illicit trade?
Thank you, John. I'd echo David's sentiments at the beginning of gratitude towards Economist Impact and the wider team. Without listing off millions and millions of challenges, I think overarchingly, At RUSI, we group a lot of our perceived difficulties in combating illicit trade into 3 buckets. One surrounds anonymity. So we've touched on it briefly already, but be it social media platforms, other companies in the private sector, and this constant push and pull between privacy rights and regulatory requirements on the other side of the coin. I think whether it's end-to-end encryption, whether it's cryptocurrencies, the expansion of the dark web, that there's constantly evolving opportunities for threat actors to use undercover settings, as well as more opaque environments to facilitate the illicit activity. Within that broad domain, a parallel challenge is the continued advancement of automation. So whether it's AI tools, other machine learning, criminals as non-criminals continue to advance in their use of these technologies. So where it might have taken human capital, human resources to commit offenses in the past, now a lot of these can be standardized within automated systems. So I think, for example, about cyber attacks, ransomware, phishing, these are things that criminals can program in advance. And if the law enforcement response isn't equally as proactive, then we run the risk that crime can expand exponentially, relatively undisrupted. And I think the third thing is just the challenges it's presented for cross-border law enforcement, governments, and other settings. We've really seen the global economy expand in the digital space quickly and rapidly. And what that means overarchingly is it's tested our existing frameworks, mutual legal assistance, the intelligence sharing frameworks that do or do not exist. And so fundamentally, I think with the speed of that expansion, catalyzed a little bit by the pandemic a few years ago, there is a growing need for us to basically reel back in as a global community and understand where can we harmonize the regulations? Where can we ensure that we all are on the same page in terms of what is licit, what is illicit, and how we can work together to start sharing intelligence in a cohesive way.
Anna, as a moderator, when someone starts nodding, that's a cue. That's a cue. Anna, jump in.
Who wants to say something? Yeah, I think it's really fascinating. We're already going into a great discussion here in the panel, and I would like to link kind of the different facets of what we heard to the theme of this year's public forum, better trade, for a better world. And I think we see on the one hand that digital trade has that potential for countries to leapfrog, for countries to be better connected, to integrate the world economy in ways that they haven't done so before, and for actors to integrate. And here, of course, on the positive side, we're thinking about women-owned businesses, SMEs, and developing country businesses. And on the other hand, we have that risk that if we don't pay attention to the potential for the dark side of trade to also use the same tools, that digital trade could get bad press. And that's what we don't want, right? So we have both sides, and both sides came out clearly in the panel already.
And Anna, this is a fascinating thing for me. I mean, when I think about just any technologies throughout history, they all have both sides. They all have ways of humans using them positively and ways of humans using them negatively. So as Mark was saying, all the things we take and we enjoy these technologies, what we have to realize is there are other people out there using them for different purposes. And I just don't think we realize that enough in my everyday. But social media, right? Is this just a fun place to hang out with Elon Musk, or is there other things going on there? David.
Thanks, John. Yeah, just building on the good points that Mark underscored earlier. Look, I mean, whether it's the Mexican cartels, the Chinese triads, terrorist groups like Hezbollah, they do exploit these technologies and this digital commerce that we were talking about earlier. And it's not only those mediums, those platforms. I mean, we're talking about blockchain, we're talking about AI, we're talking about, again, the encrypted type of technologies, not only to communicate with one another, the seller and the buyer of illicit goods, of illicit commodities, contraband, trafficking and smuggling of humans, of weapons, endangered wildlife, so on and so forth. But you're absolutely right, John, that the bad guys, the criminals, are exploiting the illicit world to expand their illicit empires, to leverage illicit commerce, open commerce, to engage in dark commerce, to engage leveraging the financial system to launder dirty money and dirty value. By dirty value, I mean the under or over exploit evaluations related to commodities. So trade-based money laundering is becoming very important as well.
David, Mark, jump in before I go on.
Thanks. Yeah, one quick point just to build off David's sentiments. I think I touched on it very briefly, but when we think about illicit trade, naturally, I think our minds go to illicit products. It's things that should not be traded and in and of themselves are illicit, or it's actions that we know to be illicit. It's the trafficking of drugs, of persons, of arms. But the staggering statistic that David presented at the onset of this session reflects not only the migration of criminal acts into the digital space, but also the ways in which new opportunities have been created by that space. And for example, you might have illicit product, timber, chopped legally for a company that is laundered illicitly. It might be illicit product like cigarettes is laundered illicitly to avoid tax. And these sorts of novel ways that criminals are finding to cheapen their business, make it more accessible, are a big component of illicit trade today, and purely have arisen out of the digital world and the emergence of the digital space that's more accessible for everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I think one point I just want to make too, for better or worse, I spent a lot of time looking at supply chains in my life. They're very interesting, everyone. They're very interesting. And what we have to understand is these are not two separate supply chains. You know, quite often, it might start off with a legitimate company. The first 9/10 of that supply chain might be completely illicit, but something happens at the end. So these things are mixed up in the current systems. I mean, I love global trade. That's why I'm really proud to be here. This is a great place. But what we have to understand is that many of the ways that normal companies do normal business are being exploited and utilized by the dark side of trade. Anna.
Yeah, if I may just emphasize that point, this was actually one of the first kind of insights we gained from the first publication the WTO has done on illicit trade, which was looking at tackling illicit trade in medical products. And we looked at what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we saw was that during the pandemic, of course, the illicit trade supply chains were facing problems due to the pandemic. At the same time, demand for medical products was surging. And that's an environment where you then have illicit trade filling the gap in the demand. And I think that speaks to your point that it's really two sides of the same coin. And this is where WTO instruments, and I'm again going to solutions already, can come in kind of, and again, the theme, if we are better on the illicit trade side of things, we probably can fill that demand in better ways without going into illicit trade. Whereas if we have problems with illicit trade, and that's not going in the right way, then there is that gap to fill for the illicit traders and for them to make profits and step into those markets.
Let's go to solutions. I've been holding back. But let's get into how do we take this on? But so it's a great point you make. But what's an example of that? If we get illicit trade better, it's going to help us fight illicit trade. What's an example of that? Oh, Helena, jump in.
Yeah,
please.
I can bring probably one example from practice. Not the good one, but this is, also lesson learned. So actually, when we are talking about some kind of problem, for example, illicit trade, we should understand that there are a lot of actually reasons and a lot of components of that problem. And it's very important to actually analyze all of them, because a state policy architecture is a difficult problem. And when we are talking about, for example, illicit trade of tobacco products specifically in Ukraine. We don't have that problem. Like e-commerce does not really, well, like a couple of years ago was not a big issue for general problems of illicit trade, and we generally didn't have a lot of illicit market of tobacco goods within the Ukraine. Why? Because the excise was really low. And it made absolutely no sense for, you know, organized crime or for some, even for some fabrics to actually fake these products or gain into illegal activities. But later we had, there was a campaign to increase the excise. This campaign was led by civil society organizations who wanted to actually decrease the number of smokers in Ukraine. I don't smoke and I'm against smoking as well. So at one point I thought that, yeah, these are good guys and they're doing a great job. But their only idea was to actually increase the excise. Another type of supporters of this reform were the Ministry of Finance and the taxation guys. As a result, in Ukraine, we introduced the changes to taxation code and decided to increase excise by 20% every year, 7 years in a row. So it's quite a big increase of excise. On one hand, it helped us to solve a problem of smuggling, because it didn't make any sense to actually smuggle cigarettes from Ukraine, because the price in Ukraine and in Europe, for example, was more or less equal, yeah, especially after the increased excise. But on another hand, it created the internal problem for us. So the illicit market internally became bigger. So what I want to tell you is that e-commerce is might be not the biggest problem. There might be problems in other, you know, parts of the solution. So while you're trying to solve one problem, make sure that your suggestion does not create a dozen of other problems.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. And we sort of see the same thing that I said earlier. There's a holistic approach is needed. But thank you so much, Elena. But Mark, I just want to come to you. Again, we're now in the happy place of solutions. So we've had enough of the problems of digitalization. But from your area of expertise, Mark, I mean, how are you seeing, or how can you see digitalization helping us deal and fight back against illicit trade?
So I think broadly, if I was to present 3 areas that are hopeful, the first is around verification systems. So be that biometric or e-verification, that's starting to filter into lots of substantially large e-commerce platforms. So we're seeing opportunities for us to clearly identify the supply chain online, which is a prerequisite for safe online trade, particularly in the use of more advanced technologies such as blockchains. Blockchain ledgers, in theory, provide much more verifiable data points. And if accessible by law enforcement, particularly cross-border, that presents a huge opportunity for us to understand in the first instance what that market looks like before we address it.
Sorry to interrupt, but where do we see that? Do we see that as consumers? Like you're saying that, I mean, I keep hearing about e-verification in a lot of discussions, but do we, the consumer, see that, or is that more the law enforcement can see these?
I think you see it at both levels. So at a consumer level, personal experiences, I've started to find that more expensive goods online offer these e-verification systems. So Amazon and eBay, buying watches and goods that are of a certain price, that they're offering that service. And that competition is good because it drives continued best practice. But as you alluded to, at the back end, there's a lot of work in the intelligence sphere that is not as apparent to the public. And that is all about understanding what can we share between each other, how much of it are we allowed to share, and who has overarching jurisdiction and authority over those data points. If I made the 2 other points quickly, one I think is a huge opportunity is around automation again. It's that when we speak to law enforcement officers and have done for decades, one of the consistent challenges is a resource one. They don't have the financial or human resources to keep up with the threats. Technology presents an incredible opportunity to automate loads and loads of law enforcement functions. We do work on child sexual exploitation and abuse, and some of the actual labor required for somebody at a desk to sift through page after page of what somebody has posted online to develop trends. Some of that work can be outsourced to technology if vetted correctly and if implemented slowly. So I think automation is a huge opportunity. And then one that will be familiar to everyone in the room is just greater public-private partnerships. So the nature of e-commerce is that it sits in the private sector, but often demands a response from both. So we need more cooperation, and there's good examples popping up around the world of task forces and bodies looking at how we can sit law enforcement in the room with the financial sector, with tech actors, and think about how these things should work in practice.
David.
Thanks, John. Look, I think any solution is very important, but it has to be implemented. It has to be enforced. I think when we talk about sharing information, sharing data, sharing intelligence, there has to be trust, because without trust, or even data integrity, right? A lot of the inputs that can go on in the trade transaction, right? Whether it's importer and exporter, and I mentioned earlier the whole over and undervaluation issue. The data that goes in has to be for real, right? Because oftentimes, criminals will exploit the data for their own gains, and that tends to undermine, I think, the whole trading system when that happens, when there's not sufficient trust, or the data that is being inputted is corrupt and not real. And so that's important to keep in mind. I also think, when we talk about paperless trade and customs, paperless, systems and trade, that too, I think, has to be anchored on trust and data integrity.
So any good moderator asks follow-up questions. I'm going to do that now, David. How do we build that trust? I mean, it's a great point you make, but let's hope we're not here in 10 years' time talking about the same thing, David. How do we accelerate that trust process?
Well, look, it takes work, to be honest with you. It takes that, bringing people together, right? Doing what the WTO, I think, did in their report, raising the awareness, right? Doing evidence-based research so that more informed communities are aware of the information, are aware of the challenges, but really having a higher duty of care as well, whether it's the private sector or governments. I think, I think real solutions are engendered in that trust by having frank and honest discussions on the issues and developing, I think, frameworks in which committed partners in the private sector can really embark on that data integrity and clean trade.
Thanks, David. Helena, can I bring you in? I just love to ask about this public-private partnerships or collaboration or cooperation with other countries or bodies. You're at a very unique sort of position right now. You're jumping in. You made all those great points about digitalization at the start, but as you go on that journey, are you seeing collaboration? Are you seeing cooperation? Are you seeing public-private partnerships?
Not always, unfortunately. But let me also add a little bit to how do you build your trust, how we build the trust to digital services and general politics in Ukraine. We just let people use these digital tools. So when they understand that they can benefit from it, when they understand that it literally improves the quality of their life, because you can receive any kind of paper, any kind of service from the state just within 10 seconds, literally. In Ukraine, you can do that, not leaving your room or not leaving even like your armchair. It really builds the trust and builds the support of the citizens toward general digitalization reform. Yeah, but when we're talking about like cross-border cooperations and do we always receive this kind of support from our neighboring countries? Unfortunately, no. Now in Ukraine, there is a big discussion about the reform of customs. It's a big deal as well, and a lot of experts, a lot of media are talking that it's important to actually reform the customs. One of the suggestions that we came up, and it really helps to, I don't know, probably take down 70% of all kind of violations on the custom, is exchange of data. So basically, when we see what kind of good, the quantity and the list of the goods which is leaving one country, and we can automatically, preferably of course, automatically check it with what the driver or a company declares on our border. It makes the life of customers easier, and it's much easier to actually find the any kind of violation. An interesting thing that Ukraine have been asking European Union to actually sign their part of exchange data for customs for the past 2 or 3 years, and we did not receive a positive reply yet. Because they believe that it's very complicated, that they don't trust Ukraine because it's very sensitive information and stuff like that. Although I believe that this is bullshit. Why? Because Ukraine is the most digital country in Ukraine. We have the most protected data. And when we have all information about all our citizens online and protected, and citizens can use this information for themselves, it makes this argument is pretty much nonsense. Another paradox is that even China agreed to exchange, to sign this data exchange agreement with Ukraine. And after we did that, we were able to actually decrease the smuggling from China in, I don't know, dozen of times. So basically, we don't have that problem with China anymore. And we really see a real improvement. But for some reason, some countries, they are still like slow with this efficient tools. Once again, digitalization is already here. Artificial intelligence is already here. So it's only a matter, will we use it to be efficient, or will we just, like say that it's an evil thing and let's pretend that we don't see it? Thanks.
Anna,
If I can
jump
come
in. Of
Yeah.
course.
So when the WTO started looking at illicit trade, it was really at the initiative of our Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. And the keywords that came out, trust, cooperation, awareness, communication, were really at the heart of her efforts. And what she asked us to do internally was to look at how WTO agreements could actually be used in synergetic ways. And that's what we did. And we found that actually a lot of times we look at, for example, the TRIPS agreement on intellectual property in isolation from the trade facilitation agreement, in isolation of the TBT agreement. And what we really did in this report for the first time was to explore how these agreements can come together and work in mutually supportive ways to fight illicit trade. And I think we need to do the same with the digital side of things. See how we can take those agreements to digital implementation levels. For example, through having the TFA is one of our most modern agreements, of course, and addresses digital tools better than maybe the TRIPS agreement. But that doesn't mean that the TRIPS agreement, for example, has things about IP right holders being able to communicate with customs. You can implement that in digital ways. And that brings me to the next point, that the other thing that Dr. Ngozi really fostered in launching that report was interagency cooperation at the international level. And for example, the WCO has tools for customs of different countries to exchange data and to communicate, and also tools for right holders to notify concerns that they may be having with goods coming in. And so this is possible if you have trust and cooperation between countries, between organizations, also within countries, between different agencies. And this is what we really need to foster with those conversations. And one last point, sorry, I'm going on a little bit long, is that I think there's still a lack of data, right? Illicit trade is naturally something where data are hard to get because it takes place in the shadows, and nobody wants those statistics to be known, really. But in order to raise awareness and to foster those conversations, we really need to have a better idea of the magnitude of the problem. And we're still struggling with that. It's still difficult to get those data, and maybe digital tools and the kind of approach that Helena was talking about can help us in getting to those data.
David, jump in. I think I know what you're going to talk about, but jump in.
Well, look, I think we do have better data now. Whether, it's at the OECD. I was the chair of the OECD Task Force on Countering Illicit Trade, and now I chair the business at OECD. Their evidence-based research and data is phenomenal. But we, the private sector, working with the OECD, are also working with Interpol. We're working with the World Customs Organization. I am delighted that we're beginning to engage the World Trade Organization, and I hope that the World Trade Organization really elevates the dynamic between licit and illicit trade, and some of the other interconnections between good and bad commerce as well. When we talk about trust, I think accountability is very important, because we can have free trade agreements, whether it's a trade facilitation agreement or many others, or even bilateral. Compliance is very important. Enforcement is very important. And being honest with the government, who is contributing, for example, the second biggest economy in the world. 11 out of the 12 transnational crime sectors, they are the lead driver. And that does not even include money laundering, where they're the biggest financial hub in the world.
Right. Thank you, David. Mark, I just want to come to you. I want to stay on data sharing. I am wondering about the incentives for data sharing. Now, I want to ask about public to private, and why would a private company, what's the incentive to share? But just maybe from your background, the more law enforcement, are there incentives? Are you seeing good examples, or are people sensitive, cautious, don't want to share their data?
I think incentives was the word I wanted to raise. So you took it out of my mouth. Building on really what everyone has said thus far, I think the key thing to understand with trust is you need a level of buy-in. So how are you convincing a social media company to share data when they profit off engagement on their platforms? How are you convincing a free trade zone authority to regulate and scrutinize what's going through the trade zone if they know they're just a transit point and not the final receiver of the goods in question? And generally speaking, what we find is data empowers people with the knowledge that these illicit trades affect all of us in one way or another. And where there is a lack of willingness to cooperate, it is often tied to a misunderstanding of how they are affected by the same threat. We don't cooperate when we think it's not our business, or it's not our problem, or it's somebody else's problem. But really it isn't. And that's where data is so useful. It helps people understand that the problem sits at both ends, and often not where we think it sits.
Yep. And can I just come back to you again on this trust, collaboration, public-private partnerships? What is the incentive for a private company? I mentioned track and trace 45 minutes ago or so. And I see private companies using their track and trace to, well, track and trace their own products. Are they sharing that? What's the incentive for a private company to share it with either their government, or an international body? Are there incentives? Is it in their interest to share that data with public officials at any level?
I'm not from a private company, of course, so I can't speak on their behalf. What I can talk about is, for example, conversations that I've witnessed up the road at the World Intellectual Property Organization, where I saw that private companies such as DHL, for example, or other the conversations up the road at UNCTAD, where it was shipping companies actually using algorithms to determine risk profiles of shipments, and to be able to actually see whether that consignment is likely to be caught by customs or to be illicit, and hopefully then caught by customs. And I think private companies, those shipment companies, for example, in the end, they have a problem not getting paid for consignments that are being caught at the border, right? So basically, improving the border mechanism also increases the incentive for the private company to then up their game and share the data in advance to know whether it's worthwhile for them to put something on their ship or not. And so this is how we, I think, can increase efficiency and create win-win solutions for everybody.
Absolutely. Helena, can I just come to you again on a similar point about your private sector? Are you getting that cooperation? I mean, we need more data, we keep hearing. From your private sector to you and your colleagues, are there incentives? Is there cooperation with you at your level?
Yeah, there is cooperation, and we are very happy with this cooperation. Once again, how did we manage to establish this fruitful cooperation between the state and private sector in terms of exchanging data and actually helping each other to collect data and provide better services for citizens and for companies? We gave them something as well. So like, love is the way that takes two. It can't be only, state that asks companies to do something without anything to share. So, for example, what is the example of this cooperation between state and private sector in Ukraine? As I already told you, we have the state mobile application where citizens can receive majority of their services, and actually they don't even have to interact with the state or state officials. They simply take this information from the, for example, the service or payment or information is generated from the state registries. But there is an important issue of security. Yeah. For example, like, how do you make sure that it's me trying to request information about myself from the state list or state registers and not someone else? And we realized that state does not have such resources to identify each and every citizen of Ukraine. But 10 years ago, we already had very efficient banking system, online banking system in Ukraine. So this was also one of the sources of actually where we took this example. So in Ukraine, already 10 years ago, you could actually open bank account, you could close bank account, you could wire money, you could pay taxes, you could buy any ticket online with your mobile phone through bank mobile application. And they already verified majority of the citizens, this or that bank. So we realized that there is no sense to actually establish another system of identification people, but we can actually cooperate with a couple of the biggest banks that have their system of verification. And now this state mobile application suggests you 7 types of verification, and 3 of them are through basically private or stand banking. So like you can use your bank ID to access your state ID, so to say. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Really, really fascinating. Now, for everyone in the room, 5 minutes, get your questions ready, right? I've got a couple more here, but get your questions ready.
Can I just jump?
Please
Point.
jump in there. Yeah.
Just 2 seconds or 2 minutes. Really, what this shows is something I think that's, again, very important for the theme of our public forum. And like, we cannot increase the burden on, for example, developing countries in enforcing the rules, and digitalization actually can sometimes have those efficiency benefits that lower the barriers also to the enforcement effort and make it more easy to comply. And I think that's something where we really need to tap into that potential more and more, because of course we need to keep in mind that some of the flexibilities that we, for example, have in WTO rules in the IP sector and in others are there to really respect the capacity of countries to invest resources into implementing rules, and we need to be efficient and think about that also in fighting illicit trade. And if we can leverage the opportunities that digitalization brings, to actually lower the barriers and lower the cost for countries to fight illicit trade, that would be the ideal outcome.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, one thing I think, Helena is a great example with China there, but I think it's on the WTO, maybe research institutions like us. I just think positive examples. We need to keep sharing, and this is part of it, right? Keep sharing what's working, because that's going to help efficiencies. If two countries can work this out, or there's an example, other example over here, the more we can share, particularly with developing countries who don't have the resources that developed countries have, I hope that's a real positive. So just a few minutes before I come to our great audience here in the room. But David, I just want to ask you a little bit of question on consumers or everyday people. When I talk to people about illicit trade, and I've been talking to people for a long time about illicit trade, I do hear people say, well, it doesn't impact me, so I'm not too bothered, right? But as I've developed that conversation and you find ways to bring the sort of negative aspects of illicit trade to that person, to their community, they start to feel it a bit more. So for the everyday person who's out there, are there ways, David, of bringing it closer to them so they realize the negative impacts, which we're all aware of in this room and online, but just on the consumer side, because I do hear people say, well, if it doesn't impact me, I don't care. How do we do this better?
Yeah, it does obviously impact them, even though they might not be aware. Whether it's fake medicines, right, which has a devastating impact in sub-Saharan Africa and other places as well, to really contaminated, products that do also create injuries. Fentanyl that is being trafficked by the cartels and others, not only in the US, but increasingly in Canada and South America, if not globally. But it's what we're doing here, building awareness, doing the reports, evidence-based report, doing the index that the Economist Impact will launch shortly, and doing these campaigns, showing the true harms and the impact. Just one last point on incentivizing governments and the private sector. Look, we all want clean markets, clean trade, market integrity, so on and so forth. In the US, the private sector works closely, for example, with the IPR Center, the National IPR Center, and with other fusion centers, by sharing information, because the incentive is to do more investigations, prosecutions, and shutting down illicit markets as much as possible. And lastly, I think we need to make corruption central to the fight.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Thanks so much, David. Right. Audience, we've come to you all. Oh, we've got great questions. So please, we'll start here and then we'll go down the back. But yeah, just press your little button and off we go.
Thanks so much. My question is to Ms. Muller. So this session was to release the finding of the Economist Index, which is supported by Philip Morris. But this kind of sponsorship is a form of tobacco corporate social responsibility marketing that's banned in many WTO members. And the World Health Organization notes that the tobacco industry's activities on illicit trade are organized to lobby against tax increases by claiming that they increase smuggling. Even though, according to the World Health Organization, evidence shows that tax increases are the most effective means of reducing tobacco consumption and the deaths caused by tobacco. And like other tobacco companies, Philip Morris has been found to be being complicit in tobacco smuggling. They were fined by the EU for it. And there's a handout outside this room explaining about that. And almost all WTO members are parties to the World Health Organization's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which has agreed guidelines, as you know, that said governments should keep the tobacco industry at arm's length and only interact with it when strictly necessary to effectively regulate the industry. So I was wondering what assurances that you can give us that the WTO Secretariat from the WTO Secretariat, that in future the tobacco industry will not be given a platform at WTO public forum sessions, because by giving the tobacco industry a voice here, the WTO Secretariat's actually facilitating the violation of the WHO's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. Thanks.
Would you like to give more insights into the sponsorship that you're taking?
Yeah, I can do that. So at Economist Impact, we work with sponsors of all types from all over the world, and we feel strongly about this issue. there are no winners from illicit trade. And we've talked about the harms up here for the last hour or so. So I can't speak to some of those broader issues you spoke about, but I can speak from our perspective that we've been working with PMI and others for a long time on illicit trade because it aligns with our values in that space. And I'd like to get to a place maybe in 10 years' time where we don't have to talk about illicit trade anymore. We can talk about other things. That would be progress for me. So that's our position on illicit trade. We do want to stamp it out. We do want to keep researching it. We'd be happy to not talk about it one day, but once it's over and done.
Hey, John. So obviously, I don't speak for the WTO, but as a former U.S. diplomat, we work very closely with all industries, as John just mentioned. And we were talking about informing consumers on the impacts and the harms. I wrote the first national security strategy to combat illegal tobacco, working with all the U.S. law enforcement agencies and international. Why? Because the global illegal tobacco trade harms not only industry, but harms governments. And it is a reality that the cartels, that Hezbollah, many others, and corrupt officials are behind the illicit trade as well. So it's important to understand, again, this illicit dynamic so that we can have, again, cleaner trade and cleaner markets. And I personally applaud the WTO for having this discussion today.
Thank you. If I can just add off the record, the WTO Public Forum is there to allow for a plurality of views. That includes, of course, the views of the Third World Network, just as people organizing sessions, and the sessions are accepted with that in mind. I personally accepted the invitation to speak on this panel. What I presented was not the report that was done by the Economist Intelligence Unit, but the WTO publication, which in itself has also the disclaimer that it has been prepared under the WTO Secretariat own responsibility without prejudice to the position of WTO members and to their rights and obligations. And of course, the WTO has not taken any funding or sponsorship to come up with its own report. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We had a question down the back.
Yes, hello. I'm Karina Strømme. I'm from the Norwegian Trade Campaign. And we share the concerns of the Third World Network raised about the role of Philip Morris in supporting this session. And given Philip Morris's documented involvement in illicit trade and the fact that its CSR initiatives are restricted in many countries in accordance with the World Health Organization's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, what measures does the WTO take to ensure that partnerships with entities' involvement in illicit trade do not undermine its effort to uphold global trade integrity and support effective regulatory frameworks, including those aligned with the WHOFCTC? Thank you.
Thank you very much for voicing those concerns. We take them very seriously, and I would invite you to continue the conversation after the session so that we can get to other questions as well. Thank you.
Right, we have a lot of questions down this side. Maybe I'll start over here and then we'll work our way down. Thank you.
Thank you to the panel for an excellent discussion. My question is around data exchange. I think as the panel has unanimously agreed, data is one of the most important commodities, if I can put it that way. The moment you speak of data, you speak of consent. And my question was, what do you think is the role of citizen consent in informing data exchange policies? Thank you.
Team. Mark?
Yeah, happy to go first. Thank you for the question. I think you're right to connect data inherently to consent, particularly where personal data is involved. I can't remember who might have mentioned earlier, but one of, I think, the pressing challenges is how to harmonize national legislation, regional legislation that isn't aligned in terms of personal consent. So a frequent example used is how different the GDPR is here to what US regulators might have, for instance, in their views on personal data. There are further complexities in the context of social media companies. How much liability is the company under for things that individuals within their social platforms are saying and doing and acting? So I think it's an important question. I don't have an answer, so to speak. However, I think tying this back in with a point David made a few minutes ago, there's incentives amongst the general population to be A, more aware of how illicit trade works, but B, because we can help hold these companies to account. Things like child sexual exploitation are not good things for social media companies. And the more people are informed of what's happening, the more people are informed about how their data is or is not being used, where it is or does not sit, the better the media can help us hold companies to account, the better regulators can bounce on that. So it's a bit of a circular response, but I think fundamentally, the more information we have on how these illicit trades work, the more naturally it will progress that all of us will start to, in our own different spheres, complain and raise queries about where our data is and isn't sitting. And I like to be a bit optimistic, but I think naturally things tend to trend towards what I would perceive as sensible. So naturally, if people are aware that their data is being used in the wrong way, it will resolve. It just needs that information to get people going in the first instance.
Yeah, just briefly, I think Mark hit it right in the nail, because if you look at an issue like child sexual exploitation, sometimes the data consent provisions do impede law enforcement investigations. So I just wanted to reinforce that good point.
Excellent, thank you. Going down that direction, yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Nasuela and I'm a WTO Young Trade Leader. I'd just like to know from the panel how we can make the fight against illicit trade more inclusive, because we could end up solving the problem in the global north and then exporting it to the global south where systems are not as robust. Thank you.
Great question. How do we make, if I've heard correctly, how do we make the fight against illicit trade more inclusive, so when we solve it in the global north, we don't just send it to the global south? It's a great question.
Yeah, I think the fact that we can talk about these issues at a forum like the WTO, for example, can help us address concerns of inclusivity in the fight against illicit trade as well. Because if we have those conversations here where developing countries are represented and the global south can be represented, then we can actually integrate this into addressing the connectivity issues that we have with digital trade and the wider development issues, and hopefully find solutions that work again on both sides of the coin, so that we can actually make it a coherent and integrated strategy to enhance participation in illicit digital trade, and at the same time also address the illicit trade problems.
Yeah, it's a great question, because if we don't solve it globally, it probably can never be solved. So it's a wonderful question. Thank you. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Camilo Velarde from the Mexican Mission. I honestly appreciate all the presentations. It was really interesting. It was truly the best for the end. And my question is related a little bit on privacy and localization of data. I agree with Ailina that for this digital technology must be open to everybody, and we must use it until there's a breakpoint, right? I just want to point out, for example, the case of Telegram that we are living today. So as Mark mentioned also, I think in that sense, the verification systems could be really important to these topics. Those were really good proposals. And yeah, I think that encryption, trust, and collaboration are really important topics on this. Now, I just want to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, happy to provide you. Thank you for the kind comments. I think, yeah, one thing to echo is that the more complex technologies, blockchain, cryptocurrencies, these sorts of things, in a way have quite naturally moved past some of the limitations we had in the past. So these are cross-border tools in design. And it means that, as you rightly pointed out, if implemented correctly, a blockchain should show you what is moving, where it originated, by whom across the world. And that, for me, is a really exciting thought. The same with verification systems, that, again, these would cut across national jurisdictional borders. They would, in a way, sidestep mutual legal assistance treaties that have been incredibly problematic in combating crimes for long, long times. So just to reaffirm your comments, that I think there's lots of reasons to be optimistic about the ways in which technology is moving forward, if for no other reason than it's helping to break down some of the barriers that we've struggled with in law enforcement and other combating of crime for a very long time.
Wonderful. Please, more questions.
Thanks. Marina Foltea from Trade Pacts, International Trade Consultancy in Geneva. I'm very puzzled by this topic, and studying trade law for many years, I always wondered why there is no agreement on illicit trade in an organization actually dealing with trade. So my thinking and following the debates which have happened already in the room is that just one consideration is that World Trade Organization is busy measuring illicit trade, but if you disregard the illicit trade, then the share that you are measuring in the global trade is actually decreasing. So the diplomats and the resource actually spent will be focusing on a reduced segment compared to what global trade in fact could be had it been possible to move it from illicit into licit camp. So that would be, for me, may sound theoretically, but it seems somehow logical that a world organization dealing with international trade would not disregard this side of the story. So on the other hand, the World Trade Organization deals with illicit on the segment of counterfeit only, which is a small segment of overall illicit. And we can say that actually there is no instrument in place which would directly address this big issue. And as an introduction, the question is, should there be willingness from member states to acknowledge the issue and start dealing with it, not only through sharing information at the public forum, which is a good first step, but saying that, well, we are sort of open to create some new rules, even if that would be plurilaterals, because multilaterals are more difficult now to achieve. We know that. So ideally, to Anne, maybe John, what would you think the norms could look like in this, so to speak, illicit trade agreement for the future at the level of norms and international cooperation? And we leave aside the compliance. We know that compliance is very important, of course. So just at the norms side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think these are fascinating and very interesting questions. And yes, of course, we talked about the two sides of the coin and that one suffers if the other takes overhand. And so I fully agree with you. I think the issue is a multifaceted one, right? And what we saw with this report is that a first good step is to look at the existing rules and how we can use different elements that are already in the WTO agreements to actually instrumentalize them in the fight against illicit trade. And you have those elements. This report was a first kind of foray into looking at this. My colleague Doa then also did an event and a publication on food fraud, looking at the agricultural trade side of things. And what we see is that depending on which facet of the illicit trade problem you look, maybe you look more at IP disciplines, you look more at TBT disciplines, you look more at TFA disciplines. So it would be difficult to have one agreement on illicit trade and covering all types of illicit trade and setting out all the solutions, I think. So what's important, and there you ask exactly the right question, is how can members start talking about this, start exchanging views and best practices maybe, and then how can we take that conversation forward?
Absolutely. I think the only thing I would add from my perspective is what I keep hearing in panels like this, the research we do, is that there's not just one solution. So any sort of guidelines or norms we would develop would have to be multifaceted, as Anna just said. We've heard examples on here this afternoon, where someone tries to do one thing, but there are knock-on effects. So if there aren't other policies in place, other norms in place, you may not deal with the problem. That may sound big and daunting, but I think, there's a lot of, the more we do this work, the more we have these discussions in these sort of forum, hopefully there's more people doing these things. And I'm a big fan of case studies, and that can help drive norms. So there's a lot to do. As we saw in our index, there's a big gap at the top. There's not many countries who are really, really doing this well, but more research, more discussions, we create more norms. But I think we've run out of time. So the last thing for me to do is to say thank you to a few people and organizations. I want to thank the WTO for allowing us to be here. I want to thank PMI for sponsoring our work continually and for many years. We take this issue really, really seriously. I'd like to think that I'm not here in 10 years' time talking about illicit trade, but let's see how we go. I'm really a big fan of research. I'm a big fan of conversations. I really want to thank our experts here on the stage. And I know it's been a long week, so thank you so much for all joining us here on the last session of the public forum. But thank you all. I wish you well. Take care, everyone.